There was a moment in 1978 when the entire Tonight Show studio fell silent. Dean Martin had just spoken one sentence. Eric Clapton's face told a story that Johnny Carson would never forget. The year was 1978. The Tonight Show had been Johnny Carson's kingdom for 16 years, and he had mastered the art of late-night television like no one before him. The stage was familiar to millions of Americans. The blue curtains, the desk, the band led by Doc Severinsen. It was a place where legends came to be celebrated, where careers were made, and where moments became part of television history. But on this particular night in March, something unusual happened. Something that the audience at home never fully understood. Something that the crew in the studio would talk about for decades afterward. Eric Clapton sat in the guest chair, his hands folded quietly in his lap. He was 33 years old, though he looked older. The years had been difficult. Everyone in the music industry knew the stories, the addiction, the loss, the long periods of silence. He had come to The Tonight Show not as a superstar demanding attention, but as a musician trying to rebuild. Johnny Carson knew this. He always did his homework. He knew which guests needed gentle handling and which ones could handle the full force of his comedy. Eric Clapton on that night needed gentleness. What Johnny didn't account for was the guest who came before him. Dean Martin appeared on The Tonight Show regularly. He was one of Johnny's favorite guests, effortless, charming, always seeming slightly intoxicated, though no one could prove it. Dean had a way of making the entire show feel like a party. The audience loved him. Johnny loved him. The crew loved him. On this night, Dean was in top form. He had performed 2 songs with Doc Severinsen's band. He had told stories about Frank Sinatra and Sammy Davis Jr. He had the audience laughing so hard that Johnny had to pause for nearly a minute before he could continue. It was the kind of performance that reminded everyone why Dean Martin remained relevant decades into his career. He didn't try hard. He didn't need to try hard. That was the magic of Dean Martin. As Dean's segment concluded, Johnny walked him to the edge of the stage. They exchanged the customary handshake. Dean waved to the audience. The applause was thunderous. But Dean didn't leave immediately. He lingered near the curtain. Johnny noticed this. The cameras noticed this. But the audience at home didn't think much of it. Dean Martin often took his time exiting the stage. What happened next would become one of those moments that existed only in the studio. Johnny returned to his desk. He straightened his tie. He looked into the camera with that familiar smile that had welcomed viewers into their homes thousands of times before. "Ladies and gentlemen," Johnny said, his voice warm and inviting, "our next guest needs no introduction, but I'm going to give him one anyway." The audience laughed. They always did. Johnny had a way of making even the simplest introduction feel special. "Please welcome to The Tonight Show, Eric Clapton." The applause was respectful, not thunderous like it had been for Dean Martin, but genuine. Eric Clapton walked to the guest chair slowly. He shook Johnny's hand. He sat down. He looked tired. And that's when Dean Martin spoke. Dean was still standing near the curtain. He had one hand in his pocket. He was looking at Eric Clapton with an expression that was difficult to read. Johnny was about to begin the interview when Dean's voice cut through the studio. "Looks like we got ourselves a rock and roll ghost tonight," Dean said. The words hung in the air. The audience didn't laugh. Not immediately. Some people chuckled nervously. Others looked around, uncertain whether they had heard correctly. Eric Clapton didn't move. He didn't smile. He didn't react at all. He simply sat there, his hands still folded in his lap, his eyes fixed on Johnny Carson. Johnny Carson felt it immediately. Something was wrong. He had worked with Dean Martin dozens of times. He knew Dean's humor. He knew the boundaries. And this, whatever this was, felt different. "Dean," Johnny said, his voice calm but firm, "why don't you let Eric get settled before you start in on him?" It was a gentle correction, the kind Johnny used when a guest crossed the line without meaning to. But Dean Martin didn't move. For approximately 60 seconds, no one spoke. The studio audience shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The band members exchanged glances. Doc Severinsen lowered his trumpet slightly, as if preparing for something. Eric Clapton finally moved. He turned his head slowly toward Dean Martin. His expression was not angry. It was not defensive. It was something else entirely. It was the look of a man who had heard variations of that comment his entire life. "I'm not a ghost, Mr. Martin," Eric Clapton said quietly. "I'm still here." The words were simple, but they carried weight. Dean Martin smiled. It was the same smile he had worn throughout his entire segment, the smile that had made audiences love him for decades. But now, under the studio lights, with Eric Clapton sitting in that guest chair, the smile looked different. It looked tired. "Well," Dean said, his voice softer now, "that's good to hear. We need you here." And then Dean Martin turned and walked off the stage. Johnny Carson watched Dean disappear behind the curtain. He looked at Eric Clapton. He looked at the audience. He made a decision. "Let's take a quick break," Johnny said. "We'll be right back." It was not the planned commercial break. The show was only 12 minutes in. But Johnny Carson had been doing this long enough to know when a moment needed air. The cameras cut. The audience remained seated. The band played softly. In the control booth, the producers were confused. They had questions, but Johnny had already made up his mind. When the show returned, something had changed. Eric Clapton and Johnny Carson talked for nearly 20 minutes. They discussed music. They discussed the changes in the industry. They discussed the difficulty of staying relevant when the world kept moving forward. But they did not discuss Dean Martin. Johnny never brought it up. He never asked Eric how he felt about the comment. He never apologized on Dean's behalf. Instead, Johnny did something else. He listened. Eric Clapton spoke about his music with a quiet passion that surprised everyone in the studio. He talked about the albums he was working on. He talked about the people he had lost. He talked about the struggle to find meaning in a life that had been lived in the public eye. Johnny Carson asked questions, real questions, not the kind designed to generate laughs or create memorable television moments, the kind that showed he was genuinely interested in what Eric Clapton had to say. The audience responded. They leaned forward in their seats. They stopped thinking about Dean Martin. They started thinking about Eric Clapton. And somewhere in the middle of that conversation, something shifted. And that was the moment Johnny Carson realized something was very wrong. Not about Eric Clapton, not about the interview, but about Dean Martin. Because later that night, after the show had ended, Johnny received a phone call. It was from one of Dean's longtime associates. The message was simple, but it changed everything Johnny thought he had witnessed. Dean Martin hadn't been making a joke. To understand what happened that night, you need to understand who Dean Martin was in 1978. He was 59 years old. He had been performing for over 3 decades. He had been part of the Rat Pack. He had starred in countless films. He had recorded hundreds of songs. He was an American icon. But he was also a man who was beginning to feel invisible. The entertainment industry had changed. The music had changed. The audience had changed. Dean Martin represented an era that was slowly fading into memory. Younger performers were taking the spotlight. New sounds were dominating the airwaves. And Eric Clapton represented something Dean Martin couldn't quite understand. Clapton was a guitarist, a songwriter, a musician who had built his career on authenticity and raw emotion. He had survived addiction. He had survived loss. He had survived the kind of struggles that Dean Martin had only witnessed from a distance. When Dean Martin made that comment about the rock and roll ghost, he wasn't trying to be cruel. He was trying to connect. But he didn't know how. The Tonight Show crew saw things the audience never saw. They were there during the rehearsals. They were there during the commercial breaks. They were there when the cameras stopped rolling. According to multiple crew members who worked that night, the tension in the studio was palpable. One stagehand recalled that Eric Clapton looked like he had seen a ghost when Dean Martin spoke. Another crew member said that Johnny Carson's body language changed immediately. His shoulders tensed, his jaw tightened, his eyes narrowed. These were the tells of a man who knew something was wrong. But the most revealing account came from the show's producer. "Johnny called me into his office after Dean left," the producer said. "He didn't say much. He just asked me to make sure Eric was comfortable. He wanted water. He wanted the temperature adjusted. He wanted everything to be perfect." This was unusual. Johnny Carson was professional with all his guests, but he didn't typically involve himself in the minute details of guest comfort. That night was different. Here is what the audience at home never knew. Dean Martin and Eric Clapton had met before. Not on television, not at a public event, but privately, through mutual acquaintances, approximately 6 months before The Tonight Show appearance. They had spoken about music, they had spoken about the industry, they had spoken about the difficulty of maintaining relevance as you age. Dean Martin had expressed admiration for Eric Clapton's work. He had said that he wished he had the kind of artistic freedom that Clapton possessed. He had said that he sometimes felt trapped by his own image. Eric Clapton had listened. He had nodded. He had said that he understood. So when Dean Martin made that comment on The Tonight Show, it wasn't mockery. It was frustration. Dean Martin was frustrated with himself, frustrated with the industry, frustrated with the fact that he couldn't find the words to express what he truly felt. The rock and roll ghost comment was not about Eric Clapton. It was about Dean Martin. Johnny Carson figured this out later that night. After the phone call from Dean's associate, Johnny understood what had happened. Dean Martin had been trying to make a connection. He had been trying to acknowledge the struggle that both men shared, the struggle of remaining relevant in an industry that constantly moved forward. But Dean didn't know how to say it, so he said it wrong. And Johnny Carson, who had spent 16 years reading people, understood immediately. That's why he extended Eric Clapton's segment. That's why he asked deeper questions. That's why he created space for Eric to speak about his music and his life. Johnny was giving Eric Clapton something that Dean Martin couldn't give him: respect. Near the end of the interview, Johnny Carson did something he rarely did. He stood up from his desk. He walked around to Eric Clapton's side of the stage. He extended his hand, and he said something that was not scripted. "Thank you for being here tonight," Johnny said. "We're glad you're still here." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything that had happened. Eric Clapton stood up. He shook Johnny's hand, and for the first time that night, he smiled. It was a small smile, a quiet smile. But it was genuine. The audience applauded, not thunderously, not with the energy they had shown for Dean Martin, but with something deeper. They were applauding a moment of human connection. And in that moment, the tension in the studio dissolved. The show ended. The audience filed out. The crew began breaking down the set. Dean Martin did not return to the studio. According to crew members, Dean waited in his dressing room until the show concluded. He watched the rest of the broadcast on a monitor. He saw the extended interview. He saw Johnny walk around the desk. He saw Eric Clapton smile. And then Dean Martin left the building. He never spoke about the incident publicly. He never mentioned it in interviews. He never addressed it with Johnny Carson. But something changed after that night. Dean Martin's appearances on The Tonight Show became less frequent. When he did appear, his segments were shorter. His humor was gentler. He seemed to be searching for something. Eric Clapton, on the other hand, experienced a career resurgence. His album sales increased. His concert attendance grew. Critics began writing about him differently. The narrative shifted from troubled musician to respected artist. Whether The Tonight Show appearance contributed to this shift is impossible to say definitively, but those who were in the studio that night believe it played a role. Decades later, crew members who worked The Tonight Show still remember that night. One camera operator said, "I've worked thousands of shows, but that night stayed with me. There was something in the air, something that you could feel but couldn't explain." A sound engineer recalled, "When Dean made that comment, the entire room went quiet. I've never heard silence like that in a television studio. It was like everyone was holding their breath." The stage manager said, "Johnny handled it perfectly. He didn't make a scene. He didn't call attention to the moment. He just fixed it. That's what he did best." These memories have been passed down through the years. They exist now as part of The Tonight Show's oral history. To understand why this moment mattered, you need to understand the era. The late 1970s was a time of transition in entertainment. The old guard was beginning to fade. The new generation was rising. There was tension between the two. Dean Martin represented the old guard. He was Vegas. He was the Rat Pack. He was an era of entertainment built on charm and charisma. Eric Clapton represented the new generation. He was rock and roll. He was authenticity. He was an era of entertainment built on raw emotion and artistic integrity. When these two worlds collided on the Tonight Show stage, something had to give, and Johnny Carson was the one who had to navigate the collision. Johnny Carson's greatness as a host was not in his comedy. It was not in his interviews. It was in his ability to read a room. He knew when to push, he knew when to pull back, he knew when to intervene and when to let a moment breathe. On the night Dean Martin and Eric Clapton shared the stage, Johnny Carson demonstrated all of these skills. He recognized the tension immediately. He made the choice to extend the interview. He created space for Eric Clapton to speak. He ended the segment with a gesture of respect. These were not accidental decisions. They were the decisions of a master. And that's why moments like this became part of The Tonight Show's legacy. Here's something else the audience never knew. Eric Clapton and Dean Martin never spoke again. They never crossed paths at another event. They never collaborated on a project. They never acknowledged each other in interviews. But Eric Clapton has spoken about that night. In a rare interview from the 1990s, Clapton mentioned the Tonight Show appearance. He didn't discuss Dean Martin directly, but he discussed Johnny Carson. Johnny understood, Clapton said. He understood what I was trying to do. He understood what I was going through. That's not common in television. Those words carried weight, because Eric Clapton was not a man who gave compliments easily. He was not a man who expressed gratitude publicly. When he spoke, people listened. And what he said about Johnny Carson was genuine. Dean Martin's side of the story has never been fully told. Those who knew him well say that he was a complicated man. He projected ease and confidence, but underneath he was often uncertain. He was often searching. The comment he made on The Tonight Show was not characteristic of his usual behavior. Dean Martin was rarely confrontational. He was rarely harsh. He was rarely anything less than charming. So why did he say it? The answer lies in the phone call Johnny received after the show. Dean's associate told Johnny that Dean had been struggling. He had been feeling irrelevant. He had been watching younger performers take the spotlight and wondering where he fit. The rock and roll ghost comment was not about Eric Clapton. It was Dean Martin talking about himself. And here is the truth that makes this story worth telling. Dean Martin did not intend to hurt Eric Clapton. He intended to connect. He failed. But the failure was human. It was understandable. It was the kind of mistake that anyone could make. Johnny Carson recognized this. That's why he didn't confront Dean. That's why he didn't make an issue of the moment. That's why he simply moved forward. Because Johnny understood something that many people don't. Sometimes the people who hurt you the most are not trying to hurt you. They are trying to reach you. And they don't know how. This story is not about Dean Martin. It is not about Eric Clapton. It is not even about Johnny Carson. It is about the moments that happen between people. It is about the words we say when we don't know what else to say. It is about the silence that follows when we realize we've been misunderstood. And it is about the people who step in to fix what we've broken. Johnny Carson fixed that moment. Not with confrontation, not with anger, not with public correction, but with understanding, with respect, with a simple gesture that said, "You matter. You're still here. We see you." If you remember watching Johnny Carson during those years, you know what made the show special. It wasn't the comedy. It wasn't the guests. It wasn't the music. It was the humanity. Johnny Carson understood that television was not just about entertainment. It was about connection. It was about creating moments that people would remember. The night Dean Martin and Eric Clapton shared the stage was one of those moments. It was uncomfortable. It was tense. It was uncertain. But it was real. And that's why it mattered. Tonight Show moments like this are rare. They happen when the cameras are rolling. They happen when millions of people are watching. They happen when there is no room for error. And they happen because someone like Johnny Carson is in control. Someone who knows when to speak. Someone who knows when to listen. Someone who knows when to stand up from the desk and walk around to the guest. That's the legacy of The Tonight Show. Not the jokes, not the celebrities, not the ratings, the moments, the human moments. The moments that remind us why we watch television in the first place. Eric Clapton continued his career. He continued to make music. He continued to perform. Dean Martin continued his career. He continued to appear on television. He continued to charm audiences. Johnny Carson continued his career. He continued to host The Tonight Show. He continued to create moments. And somewhere in the archives of NBC, there exists a recording of that night. It shows the tension, it shows the silence, it shows the moment when everything changed. But it also shows the resolution. It shows Johnny Carson standing beside Eric Clapton. It shows the handshake. It shows the smile. It shows what television can be when it's done right. If you remember watching Johnny Carson during those years, we'd love to hear from you. Tell us where you used to watch the show. Tell us what moments you remember. Tell us what The Tonight Show meant to you. We'd love to hear your memories in the comments. Because stories like this only matter if they're remembered, and you are the ones who remember. Thank you for watching.